Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first half of the 16th chapter in the book of Proverbs. It is a chapter of 33 verses. We're going to cover the first 16 in this lesson because 17 and 18 connect, as we'll review in the lesson we have prepared for this. And we did one a few months ago on the 15th chapter. We covered the chapter in its entirety. We managed to squeeze it out in a little less than 29 minutes, all 33 verses. But what we've been doing more recently is dividing these chapters in half. And before we cover the halves we just briefly review what took place in the lesson we did before it. So one of the main themes in the 15th chapter is the power of language. The opening verse reads, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up displeasure." So this is arranged in an antithetical juxtaposition. The opposites are soft answers and harsh words, and the outcomes from these outlooks spring different outcomes. So if you want to appease and diffuse wrath, you have to have a quiet, gentle spirit and gentle word. But if you want to provoke controversy or confrontation, then a harsh word is better suited for your purpose. Not that that should be anyone's ideal or goal. Verse 2, "The tongue of the wise makes knowledge good, but the mouth of the fools pours out foolishness." So our words are a reflection of our mental states. Wise people speak words of wisdom. Foolish people speak words of foolishness. Verse 4, "A healing tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it crushes the spirit." So words are tools and they are weapons. We can use them to injure or harm others, or we can use them to heal. We can mend the relationships we've wounded with healing tongues, which is a tree of life, a source of life, and a source of blessing and healings. But perverseness is a curse which crushes the spirit. So the words of our lips do affect the ones in whose ears they entered into. It seeps down into their spirit and affects them internally. Verse 7, "The lips of the wise scatter knowledge, but the heart of the fools is not so." So because the wise people are knowledgeable, they have nuggets of wisdom and knowledge to dispense with their words, which they do so. But this is something the fool lacks the necessary intellectual ingredients to scatter or spread or share knowledge, because by their very foolish nature, they lack the qualities and characteristics or language of the wise. Verse 14, "The heart of the understanding one seeks knowledge, but the mouth of the fools feed on folly." So fools and wise people naturally gravitate around their own. They surround themselves with people and influences, and "show me your friends and I'll show you your future" is the slogan or cliche, which it can be reduced to. So foolish people naturally gravitate towards foolish words and foolish people. But the heart of understanding one who has understanding, seeks to enhance that understanding through an increase in expansion and knowledge. Verse 23, "A man has joy by the answers of his mouth, and how good is a word in its season." So words can bring injury, they can bring devastation, hurt, and ruin, or they can bring joy and happiness. And to speak the right word to the right person in the right way in the right time, that is a joy beyond description. And it's really good is an understatement, I feel, for this verse. Verse 26, "Evil thoughts are an abomination to Yahweh, but pleasant words are clean." So our words are closely connected to our thoughts. If what we dwell on will be reflected in our language and words. So if we think evil thoughts, we're going to have evil things to say, and that is an abomination to Yahweh, as is evil actions, even evil thoughts and evil words are alike equally abominable to him. But pleasant words are clean. That means pure, that means undefiled, that means they are acceptable and worthy in his sight. The final verse we're going to cover is verse 28. "The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil." So we have to think before we say, and this is something I'm personally guilty of in real life. I often say what I say before thinking about what I'm going to say, but it's not a default state of mind. It's just something I lapse into occasionally, and I'm aware of it, and I'm taking the necessary corrective measures, and it all begins with an awareness. But I do generally try to think about what I'm going to say before I say it. And the wicked people, they just pour out evil as a matter of course. They don't think about what they're saying. They don't think about the consequences or the effect that their words have on others. Now we're going to open with the 16th chapter and take it all the way up to the 16th verse. To man belongs the preparations of the heart, but from Yahweh is the answer of the tongue. So the ancients linked heart as the center of cognitive activities. They did not have the knowledge that the brain was in fact the center of it. But Yahweh wants us to use our minds, and our thoughts and our thinking belong to ourselves, and we can use it or abuse it by seeking His counsel, aligning our thoughts and our plans and our wills with His. And if we do that, then the answer of the tongue will come from Yahweh if we prepare our hearts in the way that He deems fit and He deems necessary and He deems righteous. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but Yahweh weighs the spirit. Now this verse is virtually repeated verbatim in 21:2. The only change in words is instead of clean, it's right, and instead of spirits, it's heart. But heart and spirits are both internal. So Yahweh has that internal discernment. He can see past through the surface, and He judges by the spirits. And all the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes. This reminds us of Proverbs 14:12, which we also read of in 25, repeated virtually verbatim. There is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. So we are not our best judges. We are not our best thinkers. We have to submit our thoughts and plans and desires and wills and actions and schemes to the omniscient one who weighs the spirits. He has internal insight into, and He evaluates our character based on the heart or the spirit. This is the juxt of the passage of 1 Samuel 16:7. That's the story of David's anointing. He was the eighth and the youngest son of Jesse, but some of his older brothers were bypassed by the prophet Samuel, who came into, and David, Solomon's father, was identified by God Himself as a man after mine own heart in Acts 13:22. Commit your works to Yahweh, and your plan shall be established. So often it's human nature, it's the natural man's to not commit their works or their plans or anything else to Yahweh. They rely on their own radar, they rely on their own judgment, which is flawed and unreliable. But we do have the omniscient source who can confirm our status, and far too many of us ask Yahweh to bless our plans after we go through them, without consulting Him beforehand. So when you're in a dangerous position when you're asking Yahweh to bless something that He never even gave you permission or direction or indication of approval in the first place. Yahweh has made all for His purpose, and also the wicked for the day of evil. So everything in creation has a purpose and a design. Even the wicked, they are destined for the day of evil that can be interpreted as hell, death, and judgment. And He did create the potential for evil. He gave the angels and humans, thinking beings, with the gift and the curse of moral agency, the ability to decide or make our own moral decisions, determine what we think is right and what we're going to do, and what we think is wrong. Often what we think is right is in fact wrong. But this just brings us back. I cannot reiterate this quite enough, that we have to submit our plans to the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to Yahweh. Hand to hand, he does not go unpunished. So there's also a verse in the beyond the range that we'll be covering today, the 18th verse. Before destruction, pride, and before a fall, a haughty spirit. Pride is the original sin. It compelled Lucifer to launch his rebellion. He was the number two. He was the supreme created being, but he got sick of being number two. He wanted to be number one. And pride, by his pride, he tried to exalt himself above and usurp Yahweh, and he is punished. So if he, an angel, a superiorly endowed creature, is punished for his actions, that means we are equally accountable and equally liable for the consequences of our own decisions. And so pride leads nowhere good. It's an abomination to Yahweh. Abomination is perhaps the strongest word of derision and contempt. And we find it frequently, not only in the book of Proverbs, but throughout the Bible itself. By kindness and truth, wickedness is pardoned. And in the fear of Yahweh, one turns away from evil. So the word pardon is alternately translated as atoned, and the means of atonement for the Old Covenant Jews was animal sacrifices. It was an innocent animal that had to atone to vicariously to take the sin penalty for the guilty sinner. And it wasn't the sacrifice itself, but it was the act of faith which went into it. And other versions translate this as kindness and faithfulness, but the atonement, the capital letter atonement, came through the one who was the embodiment of all truth, the way, the truth, and life, John 14:6. And fear of Yahweh will be the motivation and incentive for us to eschew and turn away and resist and flee from evil. We will recognize its qualities. We will recognize its potential. We will recognize the consequences for indulging in the temptation of evil, which seems so innocent, so fun, and so enticing and exciting. But with the wisdom, if our fear properly rests in the one whom, if we fear Yahweh, then we will fear the consequences of evil and his judgment and his wrath, which he reserves to those who have prolonged practice of sin. When a man's ways please Yahweh, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So this is in some sense an extension of the golden rule, because the golden rule, as it's described or outlined in Matthew 7:12, is do unto others what you would want to do unto you. But this extends even to one's enemies. So it in fact enemies that within every enemy is a potential friend, and as Christians we are commanded to pray for those who are our enemies and revile us, persecute us, spitefully use us, and belittle us in every way, shape, and form. Every enemy is a potential friend, and no enemy is so vile as to be unworthy of our prayers. But it is a lot of Proverbs, I cannot stress this enough, they are not promises, they are principles. So not every, when we're walking in the ways that please Yahweh, Christians endure and without inviting, we experience nevertheless the contempt and ridicule and the persecution of the world. So it is an oversimplification to interpret this as a promise, but it is more accurate and appropriate to interpret it as a principle. So we should always seek to please Yahweh, and in so doing we have a reasonable hope and expectations that our enemies may be won over to us, because enemies, you don't need to provoke enemies, but Christians are not provocative people, but enemies are a fact of our existence in our life nevertheless. Better is a little with righteousness than large income without justice. So Solomon has a lot to say about wealth and poverty, and he would rather be poor and righteous than to be wealthy without justice or judgment or righteousness or anything synonymous with those terms. So the priorities is character above material resources. That is the priority. and he was uniquely endowed. He asked for wisdom when he was visited by a dream whilst after offering sacrifices at Gibeon in the first chapter of the second book of Chronicles, and in the third chapter of the first book of Kings. He had a righteous request. He asked for wisdom, and because he did not ask for wealth or the death of his enemies or long life, Yahweh gave them all to him because he was so pleased with his answer. The only thing is that the long life was conditional upon his obedience to follow the ways of his father David. But wealth can lead to wisdom, but wisdom without wealth is meaningless. A man's heart plans his way, but Yahweh establishes his steps. So once more, we are thinking, reasoning, rational beings. We have the capacities in ourselves to plan our own ways, chart our own path, but it is Yahweh who puts our feet in motions. Our plans, the fact that we are even able to conceive of plans and to set them in motion, is an act of grace and providence that we owe all to the one who created us. So he gives us the power to take that first step. He gives us the physical strength and the mental ability to plan, and the physical strength to take the steps and actions in that plan. An oath is on the lips of the king. In justice his mouth trespasses not. Now, every verse from 10 through 15, with the exception of the 11th verse, which comes after it, speaks of kings. And Solomon was writing as a king. He was a royal ruler. That was his vocation. That was his job. That was his task. He was the anointed one of the son of the anointed one who inherited the throne from one who did not have a throne to inherit. But the oath on the lips is to be taken seriously, and even kings have the potential to violate their oath. Solomon was not a man of that nature, and his mouth in implementing justice, which was one of the functions of royal rulership, if he was in fact implementing justice accurately and thoroughly, his mouth, from which his judgments would proceed, would not trespass or sin. A right scale and balances are of Yahweh. All weights in the bags are his work. So this is a message of the law, the wisdom literature, and the prophets. The practice of using dishonest or unequal scales and balances, which determine the weight of the things that the merchant sold. They were skewed and manipulated for the merchant's advantage, and the prophets repeatedly condemned it. The Mosaic Law condemned the practice. Solomon here condemns the practice, but more positively in this light. He does put it in a more negative light. He describes it elsewhere as an abomination, false weights and false measures, but the right balance and accurate scales are of Yahweh, who is truth and honesty. It is an abomination for kings to commit wickedness, for a throne is established by righteousness. So the moral consequences of a royal ruler whose entire purpose was to establish the moral role model and example for his people, it was especially abominable. It is an abomination for citizens to commit wickedness, but how much more so kings, because so much rises, revolves, and falls around leadership. So if a king is wicked or righteous, his character will trickle down to his kingdom, and his character will largely define the kingdom during the period that he reigns. And Solomon, for the most part, was a good ruler. His reign did constitute what may be referred to as a golden age of Israel. After him came the deluge, of course, because he succumbed to idolatry, and the division occurred not in his lifetime out of respect for his father David, but during his son's reign, Rehoboam. Righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is straight. So kings would have been accustomed to receiving words from courtiers and flatterers and people petitioning grievances and redresses and all that. And he would have been surrounded by counselors and advisors. And the words, the mouth that speaks righteousness would have been the delight of him because he was righteous, as would someone who speaks what is straight, that is true, that is nothing, no hidden or cryptic or anything. They mean what they say what they mean, they know what they say, and they know what they mean. This would have been a delight to a king such as Solomon. The king's wrath is a messenger of death, but a wise man appeases it. So absolute monarchs in the ancient world and even in the modern world in the Middle Ages had the power of life and death. They could deem a person worthy of execution for any violation that they deemed a threat to himself or his kingdom or anything else. But it would have been an act of wisdom and prudence to appease the wrath in the interest of avoiding the death of oneself or others, because within the king lay the power and decision of life and death. Their subjects were his to command and him to do with as he wills, and that extended to the execution. It was legal when a king ordered it. It wasn't murder or anything. And the light of a king's face is life, and his delight is like a cloud of the latter rain. So he uses light is life, and that's the metaphor and analogy. So light and life, where there is light, there is life. Before, in the created order, let there be light, Genesis 1:3, precedes the creation of all life. I think the light was created on the first day of creation, somewhere on the fifth day, I think, or fourth day or something. I think the fourth day of creation was the sun, the moon, and the stars, so the fifth day would have been the day of life. So light is logically prior to life. Without light, there could not be life, because we would all cease to exist if our sun stopped burning, as it does. And he uses a metaphor, the delight of the king is like a cloud of the latter rain. Rain is also a life-giving force. It replenishes the earth. It gives life and sustenance to plant life and everything on the ground and everything in it. And he compares his own pleasure and delight to a life-giving force. How much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is preferable to silver. So even though he was the world's richest man, he was also the wisest man, and he understood the priorities that wealth can be gotten by fools, but it doesn't last. But wisdom will accumulate wealth that can endure, but it's better to have the wisdom than to have the wealth and the understanding to the silver. So he had his priorities in line. This was reflected as a 19-year-old king. When he asked for anything on a blank slate, he chose the wisdom to rule Yahweh's chosen nation. And for that, he was granted with wealth, but he also had his priorities in order. He in the book of Ecclesiastes, he comes to the conclusion and realization and observation that wealth cannot provide meaning in life. A life divorced or alienated from God is a meaningless life, because our purpose can only come from one whose purpose is greater than ours, and our value can only come from one whose value is exceedingly greater than ours. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.